Is that cool? All right, so once again, thank you for coming to our 4 o'clock. Today, I'm happy to be handing it off for Lindsay Robbins out of University of North Texas to talk with you today. So here you go.
Like you said, my name is Lindsay Robbins, and thank you for coming to my little talk here. So I'm here today to talk about some of my work from my graduate studies in art history. I've been coming to ACON and FANS for a while now, but this is my first time ever contributing anything, so I'm really excited to be here. And I'd also like to thank the FANS committee for letting me share this with you today. So let's get right into it. What is manga? I'm going to try to provide some perspective to that question, at least within an American context, by examining the publications of a somewhat infamous and sometimes also contentious character, Christopher Hart. So he's an American cartoonist and author of Manga Mania, which is an instructional series on how to draw manga. And what I'll be presenting here today is a contextualization of his books on manga, especially his first book, in order to attempt to understand what role they have in the creation of a manga culture in the United States. So there's no doubt that manga has made a tremendous impact in the United States. The so-called manga boom at the turn of the 21st century was unlike anything seen previously in the US publishing industry, and something that many of you, like myself, may remember experiencing firsthand. As we can see in this excerpt from the Publishers Weekly, 2004, manga was invading the US. And we began grappling with the question, what is this manga thing that's sweeping the nation? While many may colloquially understand the term as some variation of comics produced in Japan, when we really dig into it, it can become so much more complicated. And I'd like to iterate that my goal here isn't to try to come up with an end-all, be-all answer to this question, but to understand Hart, his books, and the manga culture of the United States. And in order to do so, I'll need an outline to define manga within this context. So what is manga? When we think about the language used, manga boom, it sounds very violent and sudden, doesn't it? In a 2016 publication, Casey Brienza, a scholar that I rely on a lot for my research here, concludes that, quote, there was never really any real invasion, and if there was any conquest or revolution at all, it was self-induced. She provides a perspective on the publishing process as a domestication of manga from Japan to the US, much of which involved publishers' development of local content. If manga is just big eyes and pointy noses, as it's been frequently perceived, all we would need to do in theory to produce a manga is to just emulate those visual traits, and that we did. American manga publishing companies began licensing their own series, like some of which you see here, with some like Tokyo Pop doing so as early as 2002. Domestically produced manga, like those licensed in Tokyo Pop, have frequently been referred to either as OEL, original English language manga, or as global manga, and they have been a major part of the American manga culture. In the introduction to his 2004 publication, Manga, 60 Years of Japanese Comics, Paul Gravett provides the definition of manga from the Oxford English Dictionary, which had defined it as, quote, Japanese comic books and cartoon films with a science fiction or fantasy theme. He corrects this statement, asserting that manga is not animated and that there are a wide variety of themes outside of fantasy and sci-fi. The updated entry today defines manga as the following: a Japanese genre of cartoons and comic books drawn in a meticulously detailed style, usually featuring characters with distinctive, large, staring eyes and typically having a science fiction or fantasy theme, though sometimes also including violent or sexually explicit material, occasionally also applied to animated film, and extended use denoting cartoons in this style from other countries. Clearly within this context, manga isn't just any old comic produced in Japan. This definition could also consider anything made outside of Japan to be manga if it fits the bill. From the perspective of many American observers, manga is most apparent as a trend of stylistic variations of the human form, including details such as enlarged eyes, as well as other visual traits, which we'll get into shortly. But this begs the question, how are we learning to make manga? So Christopher Hart, already an established illustrator, released the first of what would later be an entire instructional series on manga, Manga Mania, How to Draw Japanese Comics, in 2001. By 2004, Hart had produced 19 books on manga and anime. He's been attributed as the world's best-selling author of drawing and cartooning books, which have been translated into over 20 languages. Hart still produces Manga Mania today, with the most recent edition in 2018. An article in Publishers Weekly from 2004 highlights the acclaim of Hart's publications as a highly successful chart topper. While there were certainly other instructional books on drawing manga released in the US prior to Hart's, such as Graphic Shaw's How to Draw Manga in 1999, Hart's publications seemingly dominated and continue to dominate the scene of instructional manga publications, having sold over 8 million titles. Certainly before widespread use of the internet, these would have been among the few sources available to American learners. Hart was also clearly aware for the potential of his success in tapping into this medium, and he was an early bird with Manga Mania in 2001. In an interview with Publishers Weekly 2006, he stated that, quote, "Manga is a trend that will become a staple. It's like waiting for rap music to fade. If you open a conventional American comic book, all you see is talkie-talkie, no fight scenes. You open manga and you see action, in-your-face fight scenes. Manga does for kids what comic books used to." So here is the cover, the front and back cover of the first volume of Manga Mania. And we can see in the text from the back cover, this book asserts that it is the only comprehensive instructional book of comics in a manga style. And I also have these up here if you would like to see them at any point. So as we might see from Hart's and other authors' instructional books, manga is presented in a series of steps, beginning with basic shapes such as a sphere for the head, as you can see on the right. Hart is not the first artist to take part in this kind of instruction. He's participating in a practice that can be traced back to the post-war period in the United States, most notably with the famous artist school of Albert Dorn and Norman Rockwell, advertised here in the middle, and with an excerpt from the course on the left. Manga Mania is the result of Hart's breaking down, understanding, and communicating the pedagogy of drawing manga, which is synthesized from personal experiences, exposure to media, and more. As you can see in this slide, we have a page from Manga Mania by Chris Hart next to a screenshot from the anime Tobor the Eighth Man. In a section exploring potential superpowers for characters in Manga Mania, Hart recalls watching the anime Eighth Man, known in the US as Tobor the Eighth Man, on television. On the right, he explains that the use of speed lines like those on the left in Eighth Man helps to create movement. There are some similarities in both of the bodysuits visually as well. As we can see from this example, Hart was certainly familiar with Japanese media, albeit media adapted for a US audience. If we consider manga as a visual style, how do we determine what that style is? Semiologist Neil Cohn defines manga in a non-Japanese context as a type of visual language. Cohn notes that this includes features such as rounder heads, eyes that are spaced far apart, in addition to a small nose. On the left is an excerpt from Manga Mania with examples of different expressions. On the right is a diagram from Cohn's vocabulary of manga. Both of these images include traits that he identifies as indicative of Japanese visual language, including things such as exaggerated and geometric mouths, sweat drops around the head, and pointed teeth. Cohn coins these traits together as JVL, or Japanese visual language, to describe a system of recognizable patterns of big eyes, big hair, small mouths, and pointed chins, the same traits that many American readers associate with manga. Additionally, Cohn summarizes statements from both Tezuka and scholar Frederick Schodt, asserting manga not just as pictures, but as, quote, a type of symbol or another language. We also have to acknowledge yet another layer of complexity, that this diagram on the right is also an interpretation of manga. So how is this language translated? It might seem odd to think of translating as anything other than textual or verbal in nature, but here we can apply Roman Jakobson's concept of intersemiotic translation, which deals specifically with the translation of images. This act draws on semiotics, the general science of communication through signs and sign systems. So what material is Hart translating exactly? Provided that he's not reading manga in its original source language of Japanese, though he could be, he has likely drawn from popular titles that would have been readily accessible to him in the United States at the time of his initial publication, 2001. This seems apparent in a comparison of the illustrations in Manga Mania to those of manga and anime popular from approximately 2 decades ago. Images from his Kids Draw Manga Shoujo, published in 2005, recall those from serializations like Pokemon or Digimon, particularly in the general shapes and proportions. There's a similar ratio of head to body size, large eyes, and similarly shaped spiky hair. Hart even acknowledges a number of these titles in the intro to Manga Mania as well, stating, quote, "Who hasn't heard of Digimon, Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, and Pokemon?" Some characters closely resemble existing characters. In this case, with the character Maximilian Pegasus from the title Yu-Gi-Oh! Airing in 2001. Here, both characters feature similar jackets in a maroon shade with gold buttons and visible frills at the neck and sleeve cuffs. They have similarly shaped long silver haircuts. This apparent borrowing from popular anime titles isn't surprising, considering how interrelated the perception of both anime and manga have been in the United States. Hart's texts create a bubble in which many of the same stylistic variations are used. This self-contained American manga culture, including Hart's publications, as well as domestically produced manga, feeds off of itself. This may help explain observations noted by Deb Aoki in a 2018 article for Anime News Network, where, in a conversation with a Japanese industry professional, Aoki found that they were shocked when reviewing the portfolios of prospective American manga artists. She explains that, quote, she'd see work that was done recently that looked like it was drawn or influenced by manga that was popular 10, 20 or more years ago. As with any other medium, predominant manga styles and trends typically change over time. In contemporary series, we can see the same traits associated with manga figures, particularly large eyes, like those depicted in titles such as Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid or ReZero, which feature similar stylization. As with more contemporary titles, however, these titles both feature characters stylized with more simplified lines, rounder forms, and noses that often appear as little more than a dot, if present at all. Despite some similarities, there's still a striking difference when comparing the imagery of these titles to those of Hart's. Even in later volumes, like Hart's Manga Mania Universe 2018, pictured on the far right, very few illustrated examples seem to resemble imagery of more contemporary titles, despite being published as recently as 2018. Hart makes clear that there's a distinct difference between the visual traits of manga as separate from a Western style of comic. What then is different about manga's visual aesthetics? In Manga Mania, he explains that the style of manga is unique, recognizable, and depicts regular, everyday people. This he differentiates from Western comics, which he asserts, quote, push the envelope to produce chiseled anatomy, intensity, and violence. In Manga Mania, we see his differentiation very clearly with these illustrations labeled Western versus the manga variations. We have the Western here and the manga here. In the images as well as the accompanying text, Hart explains that Western comics focus more on muscular anatomy, and manga typically features more boyish or softer traits. Many illustrations also implement a more muscular build alongside the use of highly saturated colors that evoke the aesthetics of American superhero comics as well. This can be seen most clearly on the left, particularly in the brightly colored bodysuit of the character here on the left. So you can see the brightly colored suit and the defined musculature of the character on the right. Not only is this a physical or stylistic variation of characters an important distinction to Hart, but the personality is as well. In Manga Mania, he states that manga characters are generally, quote, easier to relate to than, for example, an action hero who eats plutonium for breakfast and blasts through concrete walls. Superman's ears are burning for that one. Hart also suggests that the appearance of a character also indicates their personality or narrative role. In this example of a good guy versus bad guy, a few small changes are made to indicate personality. In this case, the eyes for the evil iterations are made smaller and more narrow with smaller irises. As he states in the accompanying text, good guys have big round eyes. Bad guys, on the other hand, quote, scowl and display skeptical, jaded expressions. Additionally, they may also have scars, stubble, multiple piercings, and streaked hair. Manga Mania also provides a great look into how Hart understands genres. In these 2 pages, he provides the options the reader has to choose from in expanding their stylistic variations of their own version of a manga style. So now that we've taken a bit closer look at the actual content of Hart's volumes, how do we address Hart's publications as a translation? If we consider Susan Bassnett's definition of translation as an act that involves rendering one language into another for, quote, approximate similarity, Hart's publications do seem to suggest some level of equivalence. In addition to the quotation from the back cover in the introduction to Manga Mania, Hart suggests that the reader could someday become a professional mangaka, a term typically denoting those working in Japan and producing comics for a living. In other words, the content that Hart will teach the reader to produce will be equivalent to authentic Japanese manga. Some of you may be familiar with some of the more infamous changes to Japanese media in the US, such as Brock's Jelly Donuts. You might also remember releases of manga in the States which were flipped in order to be read from left to right rather than the Japanese right to left. While processes such as mirroring of pages have largely been done away with within the last decade, the manga and anime of the early 21st century was and still is subjected to a number of editorial processes and adaptations of both art and text before hitting bookshelves. This often includes much more than simply translating text, as we can see reinterpretations, such as Brock, as well as alterations of art, such as this volume of Tenchi. Some things are left the same. For example, more common terminology, including honorifics, are often left the same. Shote notes that this causes a, quote, weird hybrid of American comic books and Japanese manga because readers now turn pages and read panels in Japanese order, but read English text inside panels in English order. These practices have all changed a great deal over time, but all of these materials would have been available to Hart and others as a reference for what manga is. It's important to acknowledge that the material that he's drawing from has already been through processes of editing and adaptation before being presented to an American audience. So to an extent, he's translating a translation. So we have another added layer of complexity in looking at Hart's publications as well, and that is the fact that many of his books, including Manga Mania, have illustrations from many artists other than himself. In Manga Mania alone, there are 10 different illustrators. Among those are a few names that I and some of you might also recognize, including Svetlana Chimkova, who you may know as the author of DramaCon 2005, a fave for me. In an interview, Chimkova explains that she's been told that her manga-influenced style looks very authentically manga. Additionally, she names titles such as Sailor Moon, Ranma One Half, and Slayers as stylistic influences for her own manga style. Chimkova is also featured in Mangaka America, a publication that features manga by America's hottest artists, quote, edited and produced by American artist Tanya Del Rio and published in 2006. This volume provides an enlightening perspective on the view of manga produced in the US in the context of the manga boom. In this publication, Del Rio provides commentary addressing manga produced outside of Japan, stating that, quote, at the end of the day, manga is just a word. I think the word manga has already been assimilated into our language to describe a particular style. Its meaning has changed for us in the West. It doesn't simply mean comics in the way that otaku simply means obsessed fan. So what is manga? What makes an American manga? Through his publications, Hart participates in an American manga culture, and his translation of the medium helps to create and perpetuate it. There are a huge variety of contributing factors when examining its origins. There's still a lot of room for expansion, but I hope that taking a look into Hart's books has provided another perspective on manga in the US for you. Questions? Yeah.
I noticed that even in the slide where you showed Christopher Hart's shoujo book, a lot of the pictures were like of more shonen themed anime. Are these books aimed more at boys than they are girls, even in the like shoujo books?
You know, it's kind of hard to tell. I think that book in particular, the cover has this sort of like Sailor Moon looking character. And I think that, you know, like with the brighter colors, there's a lot of pink and stuff like that. I think it is more aimed thinking that girls would pick it up. But there is a lot of influence on like male characters. In fact, something that I had to cut for the presentation, but I talk about in my paper that I did for the research is he loves certain archetypes like the Bishonen. And you see that continuously. And in fact, he's got like, here's the evil, like the bad boy Bishonen, but here's the good guy. And he's, you know, yeah. It is. It's interesting to see even in the later publications, a lot of this is just, it's kind of the same thing over and over again. You know, and then if you go into a craft store today, you see newer books and this stuff looks a bit more modern. And at the same time, you know, like I think that he's bringing in new illustrators, obviously, to help him with these newer publications. So some of the art does look a little bit newer. But yeah, overall, it does seem to kind of be this perpetuation of like 90s stuff to an extent. Yeah.
So do you know, like, was this the whole series like kind of own creation, or was it like sort of a commission work that he was artists who hired on and things on?
For the artist or for Hart? Hart, I think that he produces things. He's very what's the word? He's constantly producing. He's got so many books. I think that when he made that first one, I don't think he intended to make it a series. I could be wrong, but it sold so well. And he was like, well, there's a lot of potential to branch out into different areas because, you know, there's shoujo, anime. He's got an anime book as well, which is really interesting, you know, because I think that a lot of this, you know, the line between what is manga and what is anime is really blurred with his stuff, but it becomes more and more branched out. I feel like I went off on a tangent. I answered your question. Yes.
Do you think that the overall like globalization and more accessibility to manga that exists now than maybe existed in the early 2000s, like do you think his relevance has basically evaporated?
I think that a lot of people have come in on kind of his territory. I think that he was really early to it. Definitely, like, I don't know, are kids still buying how to draw books? Like, there's so much material online. Kids know how to use YouTube and stuff like that. You know, art streamers.
Something you get from a parent or like, here.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. I think that is a lot of it. I think because I know that, you know, he's a little bit of a contentious figure, especially within like art communities. There's a few American artists that I think have kind of a reputation. And so a lot of people who are in the communities kind of turn their nose up. And it is what it is. But yeah, I think that definitely globalization and internet, being able to access all of this stuff online and so many like free ways that you don't have to pay for a book or something like that. And, you know, every kid wants a Wacom tablet, and they want to learn how to draw digitally. Well, this doesn't really touch on that. Obviously, back then it wasn't as much of an issue, but even the newer ones, you know, they're digital exclusive books. Like, here's a book on how to draw digitally anime, and stuff like that. So yeah, he's kind of been, I think he's been kind of nudged out of the way, but he's still producing himself. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm familiar with like how to draw